In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to knit the long tail tubular cast on, and that's the cast on that we use for the neck of the one sweater. I'm also going to show you how to join your work in the round and how to knit the ribbing in the round too. So you start with your yarn. You have a long tail end of approximately four times the width of the ribbing that you're going to be casting on. So you want a nice long tail end, and then create a slip knot and pop it on your needle. So you pull that nice and sort of snug around the needle. Now you've got two ends now. You've got the end which is your tail end, that's this one here. Then you've got your yarn end here. You want to hold them both in your left hand and then separate them like that. So remember, this is your tail end, this is your yarn end. This stitch on the needle, we're going to count that as if it's a knit stitch. There's two further stitches that we're going to learn how to cast on, one that looks like a knit stitch, one that looks like a purl stitch when it's aligned on your needle. First one that we're going to be learning how to do is the one that will look like a purl stitch. What you do is you take your needle, you go underneath the yarn that's around your finger, over the yarn that's around your thumb, bring it around, and you'll see that the yarn around your finger has kind of created a little bump over the stitch that's on your needle, and that one will look like a purl stitch, and that's what we'll always sort of knit it as when it's in the ribbing. The next stitch you're going to learn how to do is the one that looks like a knit stitch. We're going to do that by taking your needle, going underneath the yarn around your thumb, over and underneath the yarn around your finger, bringing it around like that, and you'll see that that looks like a knit stitch, and the little purl is at the back, the little bump is at the back, just like it's a knit stitch. So we're going to repeat that. So first of all, going underneath the yarn around your finger, over and underneath the yarn around your thumb, bringing it round, underneath the yarn around your thumb, over and underneath the yarn around your finger, and bringing it round. So that's two more stitches that we just cast on. One that looks a little bit like a purl stitch, one that looks a little bit like a knit stitch. Again, underneath the yarn around your finger, over and underneath the yarn around your thumb, bring it round like that, underneath the one around your thumb, over and underneath the yarn around your finger, and bring it round. So you've now got 7 stitches cast on. I'm going to be knitting the smallest size in the pattern, the one sweater pattern, which calls for 76 stitches cast on around the neck. So I'm going to repeat that until I get 76 stitches on my needle. So I've got 76 stitches cast on now, and the next thing I'm about to do is move into the foundation rows. We call that tubular stocking stitch. So all you do is first of all tie the yarn underneath the needle. That's just to ensure that your initial cast on doesn't unravel, because otherwise it definitely will. So the first row, you're knitting into the back of the loop for every knit stitch, and then when you get to the purl stitch, you're bringing your yarn round, but rather than purling it, you're actually slipping it. So you repeat that across the row, knitting into the back of every knit stitch, and then with your yarn at the front, slipping every purl stitch. The reason why we're knitting into the back of every knit stitch is because you can see here it's that stitch is twisted on my needle. We're knitting into the back so that we can untwist it. Now on the second row it will be different. Rather than knitting into the back, we're actually going to be knitting into the front just like a normal knit stitch, but still slipping the purl stitches with your yarn at the front. So I'm just going to continue doing this across the row, knitting into the back of the loop on this row, knitting into the front of the loop on the next row, and I'll show you how it looks once I've finished both of those rows. Okay, so I've just done 2 rows of the tubular stocking stitch or tubular stockinette, and you can see it's created this kind of dense cast on here. Remember, we're still working with a needle size lower than, smaller than the needle size we'll be using for the proper rib. So if you were working in 1 by 1 rib, you could just knit your rib from here. But because the one sweater uses a 2x2 rib, we need to rearrange our stitches so that we can get that 2x2 rib formation. So the way that you do that, you knit that first stitch off your needle, just as you would normally. And now the next stitch is a purl stitch here, but you want to be knitting the next stitch as a knit stitch. So we're going to swap these two stitches around. The way that you do that is slip the second stitch onto your right hand needle, pull it off, and in turn that will slip the first stitch off the needle. Quickly catch that on your left hand needle and then put the stitch from your right hand needle back onto the left hand needle. So you'll see now that they're kind of crossed, and you'll need to knit the next stitch, and now you can purl the next two, because you can see you've got a purl stitch and a purl stitch. So essentially you're doing that across the row, knitting the first stitch, and then remember you've got a purl here, then you've got a knit here. We want to swap those around because we want the next stitch to be a knit stitch. So you're using your right hand needle to enter into that second stitch on the needle, slip it off, and that will force the first one off as well. Catch the first stitch back onto your left hand needle, then transfer that stitch that's on your right hand needle onto your left hand needle again, so that it's a knit, purl, purl. So just knit, purl, purl. So you can see here we've got 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches, 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches, and we'll do that across the row. Okay, so I've just finished rearranging my stitches, so it's now in a 2x2 layout. And what I've done now is, because I'm going to be working my neck using magic loop, I've separated the stitches that I've cast on into halves. So I've got half the stitches on this needle, half the stitches on the next. And in this section I'm going to show you how I join in the round, and it's very simple. All I do is the stitch that's attached to my ball end, I just loosen that up and I slip it off the needle. Then the stitch on the opposite needle, I slip off, hold on to it and put it on the opposite needle. Then I take this one that's looser, put it on the back needle, and then just tighten it up. And that is a very easy way of joining in the round, and it always looks really neat. So now your round is joined, and just double check that none of your stitches are twisted or anything like that. You don't want to create a funny loop. You want it all to be correctly aligned. So now I'm going to be using the magic loop method to knit my rib. So I'm just going to give this ball end a little tug so that this stitch here is sitting nicely on the needle. I'm going to pull out my back needle. It's a bit snug. Something I do want to say as well is I've actually gone up a needle size now, because we're about to knit the rib. We're going to be using the needle size that we've allocated for the rib. So if you remember, we actually cast on using 1 needle size smaller. Now we're going to be knitting in our standard rib needle size. So I'm just going to get my yarn at the back, because my next 2 stitches are knit stitches, and then it's just as simple as starting to knit. So I'm knitting 2, I'm purling 2, and you will find that when you go up a needle size, your stitches will feel a little bit stiff on the needles, but that's no problem at all. That will be fine after this first round. So just continue doing this around the loop. I'm going to continue knitting to the end of the loop, and then I'll show you how you knit the next set of stitches. Okay, so you can see that I've finished my half of the round. So once you've got to this bit and I've got my yarn attached to this needle, you turn your work and you'll have your needle hanging out like this. So you just thread the stitches onto the needle, and like I said, because this is the first round where we're using the larger needle size, you'll find that your stitches are quite stiff on the needle, but don't be discouraged because that will be much easier second time around. So you just shove those stitches up the needle. There we go. And then being careful to leave a loop on this side still. You're going to be working your next few stitches. So you can see here, these are actually purl stitches. So bring your yarn to the front and then just start purling the next 2 stitches. Make sure you pull your yarn kind of snug here, because what you don't want is to have looseness between these 2 stitches, because that will create a ladder and you'll get like a kind of looseness between that area. You'll be able to notice it in your work, so just be mindful of that. Something else I wanted to say as well is, you can see obviously I'm working in magic loop, but you don't need to use this method. You could just work in the round if you've got the correct size needle, and just, you know, knit a tube or whatever that without using the magic loop method. But in that case, if you are going to be just knitting in the round without magic loop, you'll need a marker to signify the beginning of your round. With mine, it's easy because I can see here's my tail end and here's the end of my row, so this must be the beginning of my round. Whereas with you, if you're working in the round and you don't have like, you know, this little thing to notify that you're at the end of the round and you've got your tail end, what you'll need is actually a stitch marker. You can just pop that on your needle like this to mark your beginning of the round wherever it is. So you'll put it on over here and then just continue knitting past it, and yeah, that'll just show you when you got to the end of your round. So I'm just going to continue knitting this for as many rows as the pattern requires, and then we'll be ready to move on to our raglan shaping.